Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 5. This time we're going to talk about an idea that I'm calling the ethical engine as a tool possibly to be used in making just decisions. I fell out of love with utilitarianism in a law school legal philosophy class when I realized utilitarians require us to know so much information. To make a good utilitarian decision, you need a list of every person your actions might affect. You need to know their preferences on every relevant detail, how intensely they'd be affected, and how those effects would interact with the effects of everything else happening in their lives. That's impossible. Utilitarian is not the only moral theory with calculation problems. Libertarians have a tendency to discount externalities, that is, the costs of their decisions that are borne by someone else. But externalities always exist. They are also nearly impossible for an individual to calculate if the decision is at all complex, and they should still impact a libertarian's thinking, even though they're so difficult. Otherwise, they risk creating a tragedy of the commons where people make rational decisions for their self-interest, but not fully considering the externalities they impose on those around them. This can end up making everybody, including the decision maker himself, worse off. Are you having a party late at night in your apartment? You know that can ruin the sleep for your neighbors. Did you calculate the cost to your neighbors of their lost sleep when you planned the party? Or did you take into account the cost if they retaliated with their own parties early in the morning? If you overfish a fishery, that is, trying to maximize the number of fish you take, and regardless of what it does to all the other fish, you can destroy the fishery for everyone. Do classical liberal individualists like John Rawls do any better on this regard? Well, Rawls asks us to decide from behind a veil of ignorance whether we would be willing to join a society, not knowing which role we might take in that society. This requires a vast knowledge of nearly infinite variables in the society we're considering. And in most postmodernism, you have to choose your moral stance before you could start doing your calculations if they're required. Unless your moral stance doesn't require you to consider your effects on others, in which case it might not count as a moral stance. So wouldn't it be nice if we had an ethical engine of some sort, maybe a computer or an artificial intelligence, that could do all this vast moral data collection and processing for us, and then spit out a clear course of action that would lead to maximum justice? I think we might already have one. God. Well, okay, God is not an ethical engine because God doesn't have to do any data gathering or calculation. God already knows all that stuff. And maybe that's what's behind the position the Pharisees took with Jesus. So this is going to be ethical engine number 1, possibly, the Torah law. The Pharisees knew how to know God's will. In fact, they believed God's will had already been spelled out for every decision for anybody, right there for anyone to see in the Old Testament law. Not only the 10 Commandments, but the law of the entire Torah, the rest of the 5 first books of the Bible. Do you want something that spells out for you what God's will is for your life in any situation you might face, say the Pharisees? Then go read your Torah. So you can see how a sincere, devout, God-loving Pharisee might get upset when, on the Sabbath day, Jesus heals somebody or allows his disciples to harvest grain. Those actions counted in the Torah as forbidden work on the Sabbath day of rest. Observing the Sabbath is one of the 10 Commandments, so it must be important. God put it there for a reason because God knew we needed it. If Jesus convinced people to disregard the Torah, anyone facing a moral decision would be left on their own woefully inadequate resources. For one thing, and probably not the most important thing, on the Sabbath, they would not get the rest they need. So their lives would tailspin into illness and injustice. As they tried to figure out everything on their own, they'd tend to wander further and further astray. Things could unravel until legitimate spiritual authority collapsed, leaving everyone stuck trying to discern God's will afresh on every choice all by themselves. Mistakes would pile up, central authority would erode, and the nation would descend into miserable anarchy. Jesus had an answer to those fears. He reassured the Jewish leaders that he had no intention of undermining the Torah law. In fact, he came to fulfill it. What did this mean? Jesus directed one of his questioners to consider the first two of the Ten Commandments, which are love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Then Jesus said this, all the law and prophets are summed up in these two commandments. All those rules in the Torah are there to help you love God and your neighbor. Don't let the goal get lost in the rules. Love God and your neighbor. That's the goal. When the Torah prevents you from loving God or your neighbor, love comes first. Here's one way a lawyer might read this. The Torah is intended to act as the presumed guide to any action, but the presumption can be rebutted if love for God and neighbor requires something else. Remember this model. A rule can be presumptively binding, but overridden when clearly required by a higher rule. So we have one ethical engine, the Torah law, which spells out for us the results of divinely inspired calculations, I guess, about a variety of decisions we might have to make. But it doesn't reach everything, and it is not a complete replacement for our fundamental duty to do God's leading in each situation. We still need to be prepared to follow God's leading directly, even in tension with the Torah, where love of God or our neighbor requires it. Which puts us back to square one in a way, still limited by our own abilities that are imperfect to see and understand what God might lead us to do in particular situations. Wouldn't it be good to have some way to more reliably understand God's will when we are out there navigating beyond the scope of the Torah law, where God's leadings don't seem to come through loud and clear on our individual spiritual antennas sometimes? Well, you know what astronomers do when radio or light signals from distant probes or even far, far more distant galaxies are too faint for a single telescope or antenna to pick up? They put up huge arrays of antennas, multiple antennas, which dramatically improve their reception. So here we come to ethical engine number two, possibly, group discernment. The early Christians understood this principle, as we can see in the book of Acts, when they called the first council in Jerusalem to discuss to what extent they were supposed to bring the gospel to the Gentiles. They assembled a sizable array of human spiritual antennas, i.e., people from all over who participated in the council, and concluded God was indeed leading them to include Gentiles amongst the followers of Jesus. Since then, Christians have used this method frequently to try to resolve disputes or see the way more clearly forward. As you recall from last week, groups meeting to make decisions are polities. So we're back in the realm of political science now, where we encounter a key concept, the decision rule. A decision rule is how a polity knows when a decision has been made. In a dictatorship, the decision rule is the dictator chooses. Very simple. Families are parental dictatorships if the kids obey the parents. My family right now is a dog dictatorship, a dogocracy, because Nellie, our ancient dog, over 100 in dog years, essentially dictates when and where my wife sleeps. Nellie will bark when she decides it's bedtime until Melanie lies down in the right place with Nellie nearby. I do not recommend dogocracy as a decision rule. Democracy, on the other hand, in the form of majority rule, is more comfortable for us in America, and for me too, because we understand it. It's better than dogocracy, but is it the best? Does it really perform as an ethical engine? Democracy has its strengths, which is why I'm a fan, but majorities have made many, many errors, including enshrining the most grievous injustices. Fewer injustices in dictatorships or monarchies, I guess, but too many to be content, which is why the American Constitution tries to put some things beyond the reach of majorities, such as freedom of speech and religion, and equal protection and due process for all persons. If majority rule is unreliable as a test of God's leading, what is better? The Quakers have an idea, sense of the meeting discernment. The first Quaker, George Fox, believed God speaks to each of us directly, giving us our most reliable guide to finding God and doing God's will. Rather than delegate the task of declaring God's will to church leaders, bishops, and popes and whatnot, Quakers believed they were each individually responsible to listen for God's leading for them. Quakerism took root in the English Civil War during the mid-1600s, the same era that inspired Hobbes and influenced Locke. The Quakers at first tended to give a lot of space for people to follow their individual leadings until a few of them followed their leadings to go out in public naked or reenact Palm Sunday with some Quakers hailing fellow Quaker James Naylor as if he were the Messiah. These embarrassments, clearly not leadings from God, helped encourage Quakers to use group discernment. Like astronomers trying to listen to radio signals from distant Voyager space probes, Quakers learned that an array of antennas does much better than a single antenna in picking up subtle or fuzzy signals. So they would gather in meetings of the entire congregation to quietly, prayerfully listen for the whisperings of the Spirit. Anyone who had a leading they felt was confident from God would share that leading for others' consideration. When every spiritual antenna in the group was confident that the group as a whole was hearing the leading truly, the clerk would ask, "Are all hearts clear?" The decision was made when all hearts were clear. This practice has two major benefits. First, it helped deter the bizarre enthusiasms of some of those individual friends that I talked about. But more importantly, it lent courage to friends when they undertook risky actions endorsed by the meeting, like illegally preaching in the streets, like Paul had done, or refusing to be conscripted into one of the rival armies fighting in the English Civil War. Later, the practice of meeting for worship for business led to Quaker leadership in movements to abolish slavery and end mistreatment of Native Americans and reform prisons. Sense of the meeting decision-making is still practiced in most Quaker churches and meetings, including meetings of the George Fox faculty. I submit that group spiritual discernment like this is a legitimate possibility as an ethical engine. Melanie and I used it to confirm that we were being led to marry, and we have seen that Quakers used it to take leadership in major social reforms. Quaker's sense of the meeting decision-making doesn't always succeed. Even Northwest Yearly Meeting and Friends, which founded George Fox in 1891, split in 2017 because no sense of the meeting could be found about how to treat LGBTQ people. But we do have two powerful but imperfect ethical engines now, Torah law and Quaker sense of the meeting decision-making. Are there other ethical engines? Paul seems to propose one in the New Testament. Writing to Christians in Rome, Paul urges them to obey Roman authorities because they are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience. That's Romans 13, 4 through 5. Note that, also as a matter of conscience. This is the Roman law we're talking about, a system dominated by the Roman emperor, where the Senate had never represented anyone outside of central Italy and had lost almost all of its power anyway. It was a vast, corrupt monarchy assembled by conquest and maintained by coercion. Of all the political philosophers we've studied so far, perhaps only Thomas Hobbes would accept the Roman Empire as a legitimate moral authority to which a citizen would owe obedience just to avoid plunging society into something worse like anarchy. Hobbes would base this on Rome's ability to impose order and stave off anarchy, not any tendency for it to have enlightened rule. But Paul says this is enough to require us to obey as a matter of conscience. Perhaps we can recognize a prudential obligation to not weaken a dictatorial government so as to avoid an even worse fate like anarchy. But does that make the dictator's edicts legitimate authority for how to do justice? We critique democracy for its tendency to enshrine injustices sometimes, supported by a majority. Isn't a dictatorship even worse? Let's look for a more inspiring example where a government could serve really as an ethical engine worthy of obedience because, taking everything into account, it is making better, more just decisions than we could do. So this will be ethical engine number 3, a connected, rational, public-spirited, and effective legislature. Imagine a government adept at reaching the most just outcomes and writing the most just laws by collecting and usefully processing rich and accurate information on citizens' situations and preferences. Could it earn legitimate authority to the extent that its laws and policies would presumptive authority as to how to do justice? Such a political system would need to meet the following criteria. First, connected. Legislators would be richly connected to all sectors of the population. This is a job too big for one person. Again, we need an antenna array, enough legislators so each district can be small enough for one person to get to know all the following factors: what their district residents value, what their dreams are, whether changes would make them better or worse off, and how all these factors interact. Selecting legislators in competitive elections would give candidates incentive to go out and learn all these nuances about their district. Second, the legislature would have to be rational. The individual legislators' deliberations need to be rationally balanced and take into account all the people's interests. Legislators themselves should be rational, but more importantly, the process should give all groups influence in rough proportion to their population, so votes in the legislature effectively reflect the various interests of the state. Any process that ignores any major group's interest would not be rational. Third, public-spirited. The representatives need to be or convincingly pretend to be overwhelmingly motivated to seek the benefit of the entire population. Legislation designed to line legislators' pockets is not likely to provide good moral guidance for the rest of us. Effective. Number 4, the efforts of a mere debating society are not as likely to be as morally instructive as the work of a group who know how people will generally obey their laws, or whether they will. So the lawmaking group's work has to produce predictable levels of compliance. Who is better at calculating the effects of going 20 miles per hour over the speed limit, you or the state legislature? Do you have the legislature's ability to summon the advice of traffic safety engineers, or to collect stories of mangled people in morgues and emergency rooms, or to count the cost of traffic jammed and jobs and lives lost due to speeding accidents? No, you don't, no matter how crazy your internet skills are. Since I cannot come close to matching a connected, rational, public-spirited, and effective legislature in calculating the effects of my action, I can best love my neighbor by giving the law it makes very strong presumption of legitimacy. This presumption could be overcome, but it would be a high barrier, and the better the legislature, the higher the barrier. Where the legislature is reasonably unaffected by corruption and partisan dysfunction, I would probably never be justified in disobeying a law on my own decision, given my fallibility in doing the calculations and in understanding God's will. In any case, I would have to make my decision to disobey the law produced by a good legislature with the input of a pretty high-powered group of advisors. So the law could be an ethical engine when it is created by a form of due process, notice, democratically connected, rational, including taking into account opposing views, public-spirited, and effective. But there's one more I want to bring up today, ethical engine number 4, the common law. Law generated by a different but perhaps even more powerful form of due process when it is the product of common law legal systems featuring adversarial process and a commitment to stare decisis would be very likely to be a moral authority. Now I'm going to define some of those terms. The common law was developed in England and spread to far-flung British colonies, including America. In common law systems, court cases developed much of the law by resolving factual and legal questions employing adversarial process. Where cases are largely driven by the parties, and what happens in the courtroom is mostly decided by the parties, within rules designed to give both sides a full and fair hearing and to keep unfair, prejudicial influences out of the process. We can assess the common law as an ethical engine by focusing on the appeals process, where issues of law can be decided. Usually the appeal is a matter of right, at least at the first level. When the case is especially important, such as when it is not obvious which way the case should be decided, each side gets a chance to write out a lengthy legal argument and then have an oral argument before impartial judges. The judges must refer to previous cases when deciding their case and decide the case in front of them consistently with those previous cases. This rule is called stare decisis, Latin for let the prior decision stand. In rare cases where the court is the highest court in the jurisdiction, it can overturn a prior case when the court is convinced it was wrongly decided. So I want you to think about this. A case decided in an appellate court opinion in a common law system has been argued by trained, skilled lawyers, each duty-bound to make their client's best arguments, and each in control enough of the situation they can make the arguments the way they want. The judges are also lawyers, usually among the most highly respected for the wisdom and skill. All the lawyers and judges draw on vast libraries of prior cases going back hundreds of years, also argued by lawyers and decided by prestigious members of the legal profession. Appellate opinions are written by those appellate judges explaining their decisions. These opinions can be read and critiqued by any member of the public, lawyer or non-lawyer. You've never written a paper with 1/100th of this volume of supporting material, or 1/1000th of the scrutiny. And we've never had to make our arguments stand up in comparison with hundreds or thousands of other arguments going back to the 13th century. Who are we to second guess the results of common law appellate process? Well, we are citizens in a democracy, so of course we can critique them, but can we ignore them and still be in the right? I suggest the answer is presumptively no, and that presumption is not easily rebutted. So that's 4 ethical engines we've talked about: the Torah law, Quaker sense of the decision-making, the law of a connected, rational, public-spirited, and effective legislature, and the common law as articulated in appellate court decisions. I think there's a 5th possible ethical engine we will need to consider later this semester, the free market, but I'll put that off until week 10 or 11 when you've had a chance to watch some of Nate Peach's lectures, bringing concepts from economics into our discussion. So nearly done now, but before I finish, I got to talk about a promise I made last week to explore why Jesus didn't take over kingship of the world 2,000 years ago and why he doesn't do that today. Wouldn't Jesus' direct rule combine and improve the virtues of all 4 of these ethical decision-making engines that I've talked about? We would be able to drop the presumptive tag and just obey Jesus' emails. Be very simple, justice solved. Well, we don't have time to get to the bottom of the question this week. I promise we'll consider it fully next week. But in the meantime, I want you to think about this. I wasn't the first person to suggest Jesus should have taken power 2,000 years ago, maybe. Read about who was the first person in Matthew 4, 1-10, or Luke 4, 1-12. Okay, until next week.